Steve Carell's Space Force was supposed to be the spiritual successor to The Office, though sadly it failed to live up to its star's best-known work. With Carell teaming up once again with The Office co-creator Greg Daniels, the Netflix comedy Space Force launched in 2020 with a high-profile cast and a sky-high budget. However, despite the hype, the show never quite found its comedic rhythm, and after 2 seasons was grounded for good. While it had flashes of smart satire, the show lacked the warmth and razor-sharp writing that defined Carell's breakout sitcom. For fans hoping for another laugh-a-minute show like The Office, Space Force just didn't deliver. However, what many fans may have missed is that after Space Force, Carell pivoted to a different kind of role entirely, one that proved he's not just a sitcom star but a truly versatile actor. While Space Force fizzled out, Carell quietly starred in a psychological thriller that showcased his most grounded and emotionally intense performance since leaving Dunder Mifflin. This lesser-known Steve Carell show is The Patient, a Hulu original that flew under the radar despite strong critical acclaim and a gripping premise that allowed Carell to stretch his dramatic chops in surprising, unforgettable ways. Space Force wasn't a good Office replacement, but Steve Carell was great in The Patient. Steve Carell's Space Force didn't land, but The Patient proved his serious side was worth watching. Space Force had all the ingredients for a comedy classic: Steve Carell, a timely political backdrop, and a stacked cast including John Malkovich, Ben Schwartz, and Lisa Kudrow. However, despite seeming like a recipe for success, the Netflix series struggled to match expectations. The tone was uneven, the jokes often fell flat, and the writing leaned more into bureaucracy satire than laugh-out-loud comedy. It wasn't terrible, but it wasn't the heir to The Office throne fans had hoped for. Carell's character, General Mark R. Nerd, was amusing in parts, but never felt as compelling or lovable as Michael Scott. That said, Steve Carell's work in Space Force wasn't the problem, as his delivery was solid, and he committed to the character with his usual charm. The issue was the writing, which never quite figured out whether it wanted to be a biting political satire or a workplace sitcom in space. After Netflix cancelled Space Force in 2022, it felt like Carell's next project might be just as high concept or comedic. Instead, he delivered one of the most haunting performances of his career, Enter the Patient. Premiering on FX on Hulu in August 2022, the limited series was a sharp departure from Carell's usual fare. In The Patient, Steve Carell plays Dr. Alan Strauss, a therapist who's kidnapped by his own patient, Sam Fortner, Domhnall Gleeson, a serial killer who wants help curbing his homicidal urges. It's a claustrophobic, slow-burn thriller, with most of the show taking place in one small basement room. However, within those tight confines, Carell delivers a gripping, emotionally layered performance that gradually reveals his character's trauma, grief, and resilience. The contrast between Space Force and The Patient couldn't be more stark. While Space Force tried, and often failed, to land punchlines, The Patient focused on psychological depth and emotional tension. His understated portrayal of Alan Strauss reminded viewers that Steve Carell is capable of far more than playing a clueless boss or a goofy general. He brought quiet intensity, believable fear, and emotional vulnerability to the role, qualities that were largely absent from Space Force. If Space Force left you feeling like Steve Carell's best days were behind him, The Patient made it clear that he's just getting started. The Patient is totally different from Steve Carell's other shows, but it deserves more love. Steve Carell's Space Force got the attention, but The Patient is the real must-watch. Dr. Alan Strauss, Steve Carell, talking to his therapist Charlie, David Alan Grier, in The Patient. While The Patient didn't explode onto the cultural radar the way The Office or Space Force did, it quietly became one of the most critically acclaimed performances of Steve Carell's career. With an 89% score on Rotten Tomatoes, the series received praise for its tight pacing, eerie atmosphere, and standout performances from both Carell and Gleeson. Yet, despite the critical acclaim, The Patient didn't get the widespread audience or viral traction it deserved, likely because fans still expected Carell to be funny, not frighteningly intense. What sets The Patient apart from the rest of Carell's TV work is its complete rejection of comedy. Unlike The Office, The Morning Show, or Space Force, there are no punchlines or awkward laughs here. Carell's Alan Strauss is a man quietly unraveling under unimaginable stress, and his performance is deeply internal. It's a far cry from the exuberant antics of Michael Scott, but no less captivating. For longtime fans of Carell, the shift might be jarring, but it's also revelatory. The Patient digs into themes of guilt, trauma, and forgiveness, with a slow-burn approach that rewards patient viewers. Carell's scenes with Domhnall Gleeson are especially electric, tense, unpredictable, and layered with unspoken emotion. The minimal setting and focused storytelling allow Carell to do some of his most nuanced work ever. It's not flashy, but it's undeniably powerful, Compared to the broad comedy of Space Force, The Patient shows a level of restraint and depth that proves Carell's range is far wider than audiences may have realized. Yes, many of his fans fell in love with him as Michael Scott, and it's undeniable that Space Force tried to capture that same lightning in a bottle. However, The Patient proves Carell doesn't need a mockumentary format or an ensemble cast to shine, he just needs a good script and room to explore. In the end, Steve Carell's Space Force got the spotlight, but The Patient deserves the praise. It's the kind of series that lingers, quiet, intense, and unexpectedly moving. For anyone who wrote off Carell's post-office career after Space Force, The Patient is essential viewing.